This week we will be talking about primate and then hominin evolution, or where we kind of get our root to our evolutionary family tree. And this material is going to be kind of meaty, which is part of the reason why I didn't want to burden you with extra assignments this week. I want you to be able to take enough time to really work through this material and understand how these various fossils fit together to give us a picture of our evolutionary history. So our objectives include describing the major anatomical and dental features that characterize fossil primates from the Paleocene, when primates first appear, to the Miocene, where we've got really a literal planet of the apes in terms of diversity of species, and to explain how they compare with living primate groups, to explain what is meant by biocultural evolution, which we've already talked about a bit, this interaction between biology and these newly emerging cultural features that we find with hominins that can then go back and in turn shape the path that natural selection takes us on. And then to provide examples as to how it might influence the development of the earliest cultural behaviors in hominins, which of course are predominantly represented by stone tools. But it would be naive for us to think that stones were the only things that kind of captured cultural essence, as well as influencing the biological or anatomical changes in them, to describe why paleoanthropology is multidisciplinary, to discuss some of the major subdisciplines, to discuss the key traits that define fossils as part of the hominin lineage. We're going to talk about the main one, of course, being bipedality or upright two-legged locomotion. To discuss the key anatomical features that characterize bipedality, and then discuss the hypotheses for the evolution of bipedality. To discuss the major early hominin finds from Africa, and to outline the hominin fossils that are assigned to the early members of the genus Homo, and explain how these differ from other earlier hominin groups, setting the stage for our eventual discussion of Homo erectus, who's the first species to leave Africa, and then the origins of anatomically modern Homo sapiens, and then to discuss the basic steps of practicing paleoanthropology. So, 65 million years ago, there was a big climatic shift, and this was due. I don't know how many of you have been to, at the very least, the Natural History Museum in Albuquerque, if you happen to be local, or a Natural History Museum in many locales. But this period at 65 million years ago is when the asteroid hit, kicking up a lot of debris. I mean, there was an initial shock wave with the collisions of asteroids and meteors with the Earth. And then there were climate shifts because of the debris, the ash that was kicked up into the atmosphere of the Earth. And this essentially really led to the extinction of dinosaurs, which then opened up the planet for our mammalian adaptive radiation. If we hadn't had that big climatic shift, I don't know, maybe we'd be bowing down to our reptilian overlords today. Not really, but we'd probably have some kind of avian kind of capstone species, and we wouldn't be around to even debate our place among those. So at this point of the climate shift, not only did the dinosaurs die, but so too did a lot of the other plant and animal species. And so, plant wise, we see the death of a lot of these conifers, these gymnosperms that were present. And we see the emergence of a particular kind of plant that is called an angiosperm. Angio means vessels, so angiosperms specifically house their seed in a vessel. They are also known as flowering plants, flowering trees, etc. And that seed in which, or the vessel in which that seed occupies, is the fruit. So primates evolved and radiated in tandem with plants that produce fruits. The Paleocene is this first period of the Cenozoic after the dinosaurs go extinct, this period from about 65 to 56 million years ago. The mammal record from this period of time is really captured in these primitive mammals, many of which are insectivores, pretty small body size. There's a particular group of primitive mammals during the early Paleocene called the Plesiadapiforms that include species like modern day tree shrews, which again are, I mean, they're small bodied, high basal metabolic rate. They have, um, they uh, start they generally eat a diet that's kind of broad, includes a lot of insects. Tree shrews are thought to essentially be ancestral to all modern primates. So there's debate over whether we would consider the Plesiadapiforms actual primates, or if we would just simply include them as members of a closely related but different group of mammals that then specializes into modern day tree shrews. We've got an abundance of fossil evidence kind of along this Rocky Mountain Rift, the mountain range that extends from Montana, Wyoming area all the way down to New Mexico. And in fact, the range, or this is kind of consistent stratigraphical event, extends all the way up into Saskatchewan as well. And so these are a well documented group. We see a lot of the variability that was present in them, and we have that in abundance. So this role of angiosperms, or flowering trees, flowering plants that produce fruits, is really key in driving some of these major defining features of primates. So we talked about these 2 lectures ago. We talked about this loss of the sense of smell, this shift towards visual acuity, including 3 dimensions and color vision. We talked about the grasping thumb. We talked about brain changes that accompany this shift towards sight over smell, the loss of the vomeronasal organ. We talked about this shift as well from smell to hands, with this tactile, this increase in the number of neural connections that can be made in the fingertips and the palms and the hands. All of these are related to this diet that is focused on fruits. And specifically, I mean, fruits are brightly colored when they're ripe. Many flowers are brightly colored as well. So having color vision gives us an adaptive advantage over species that can't distinguish when fruit is ripe. Our hands allow us to manipulate the fruit, to hold the fruit. They also allow us to leap from tree to tree so that we can travel not only through the tree that we're in, but also through other trees that may have fruits that are in season. So a lot of these shifts are driven by, a lot of these traits, these derived primate traits, are driven by this expansion of flowering plants. The first primates appear late in the Paleocene, and then the Eocene. So when I talk about these with my 101 students, 1101 students, kind of that basic introductory level, we characterize these different epochs as planet of the quote unquote, and first appearance of. So the Paleocene is the first appearance of primates. The Eocene is essentially the planet of the prosimians. We've got a vast number of fossil primates that now total more than 200 recognized species. We've got fossils around much of what we now consider the Northern Hemisphere, North America and Europe. North America and Europe were still connected at this point. More recent finds have demonstrated an adaptive radiation across Africa and Asia as well. Which they are also still, I mean, well, they're still connected now, but they were still closely connected during this time. There is a very complete fossil, Darwinius macellae, from the Mosel site in Germany that dates to about 47 million years ago. It faces some controversy as to whether it represents kind of that source kind of adaptive radiation, or how we quite fit it into our evolutionary family tree. Most of the prosimians went extinct by the end of the Eocene, because during the Eocene, while it's planet of the prosimians, we also have the first appearance of anthropoids. And so anthropoids are just simply better at doing all of the things that monkeys do in terms of their eyes are rotated even more forward than these prosimian faces have, which gives them better depth perception, gives them better color vision. They have a grade shift in brain size evolution, which gives them a little bit more intellect, which helps them to better map the patchily distributed fruit resources. Including when we talk about mental mapping these resources, we're talking about both spatial maps and temporal maps, because fruits, of course, are discrete locations throughout your home range, but they also only come into fruit particular times of the year. We do see among some of these Eocene prosimians some very derived features. Most of them are incredibly primitive, but there are some derived features like the dental comb, which are these incisors that are very close together, predominantly on the lower jaw, that help to comb through substrate to get insects out and such. And modern day prosimians possess this dental comb, or some of the species possess this dental comb. So this dental comb places at least a few of these specimens as ancestral to modern day lemurs and lorises. When we talk about where the evolutionary event was happening in terms of the appearance of anthropoids, it probably was somewhere in Africa or Asia, perhaps in China, with a species called Archicebus achilles. Archicebus achilles dates to about 55 million years ago, was definitely a haplorhine versus a strepsirrhine or prosimian. Haplorhines eventually differentiate into tarsiers, as well as all living anthropoids. So while we've got the radiation of anthropoids starting in Africa or Asia, we've got some interesting stuff going on in the New World, particularly in North America, with respect to these uh, early prosimians. We've got a group called the Notharctine primates that have been found in the early Eocene in the San Jose Formation, including the San Juan Basin of New Mexico. So we're talking about really anywhere from roughly Cuba to the Four Corners area. And then in the early Eocene in the Wasatch Formation in southern Wyoming. And we've got pretty consistent faunal deposits that extend all the way from New Mexico to Wyoming. So when we find one of these species in situ in a particular stratum, then we can date that stratum to a particular kind of range of dates. These collectively include some of the most complete species yet discovered of poorly known groups like Copelemur tutus and Copelemur praetus. And so Copelemur is the predominant prosimian fossil that we find in New Mexico. I've gone fossil prospecting up outside of Regina on the BLM land that is just bordering the Jicarilla Apache Reservation, and we find definitely a lot of teeth, a lot of copelemur teeth. And there were interesting things that were happening with copelemur that relate to our discussion of early hominins. I mean, this isn't going to be something you're tested on, but there was a shift towards different dietary niches where some species of copelemur were probably eating insects and any fruits that may have been around, while others were focusing on really hard-shelled nuts and seeds and such, maybe even some really robust insects. And so we see this similar kind of process of the thickening of the enamel and the development of musculature associated with chewing that are associated with this dietary specialization. And that's something that was going to be paralleled as we talk about early hominins. We also have the first upper dentitions for Cantius angulatus and Cantius frugivorus from the type area of these taxa. Cantius frugivorus really focusing on this emerging fruit diet. At this point, no anthropoids were in New Mexico to compete with these early prosimians. And then we've got two new named species. These two new Notharctine species, Copelemur australotutus and Smilodectes gingerichi. Smilodectes is another species that we sometimes find in New Mexico, but by and large, the abundance of the diversity of Eocene prosimians that we find in New Mexico are of Copelemur. As we move up into the Wasatch Formation, we get more of Smilodectes. So we would characterize the Oligocene or the Eocene as planet of the Prosimians, first appearance of anthropoids. The Oligocene then from 33 to 23 million years ago is going to be the planet of the monkeys. We're also at the end of the Oligocene, of course, going to find our first apes evolving. Most of the fossils that are found from Old World anthropoids are from the Fayum in Egypt. This is a deposit that has yielded over 6,000 different specimens. Very rich ancestrally, dates to, roughly 30-ish million years ago. And there are a few specimens from the Fayum that may exhibit common ancestry of Old and New World primates. There are also some fossil fragments from North and South America that relate to the ancestry of New World monkeys. What we do know is that very early on in the Oligocene, between about 33 and 30 million years ago, we've got distinct evolutionary pathways that lead to the development of Old World monkeys, apes, and then humans, and that lead to modern day New World monkeys. Some sources list these, though your text doesn't mention it, as propleopithecids and parapithecids. One of the big markers that we're going for in recognizing the difference between these two species are the dental arrangements. So the New World primates and those that give rise to New World primates fairly quickly develop a derived dental formula, which is 2123. That means two incisors, one or 2133. Two incisors, one canine, three premolars, and three molars. Those that stay in the Old World and eventually develop into modern day Old World monkeys, modern day apes, and modern humans retain the primitive dental formula 2123. So tree shrews, the Plesiadapiforms, had this primitive dental formula. So we've got one genus, Adipum from the Fayum, that represents this primitive dental arrangement, so presumably not part of this divergence for New World species. Adipum was basically squirrel-sized, ate mostly fruit, some seeds, an arboreal quadruped adept at leaping and springing. So by roughly 28, 30 million years ago, we've seen the emergence of this characteristic primate way of moving, quadrupedally on top of branches, and then leaping from tree to tree. And we can tie this to, again, some of those specific primate traits like depth perception. I mean, if you're going to leap from branch to branch, tree to tree, you probably want to be able to judge your distance, right? So that ability to judge depth perception is going to be an adaptive advantage. Similarly, this shift to hands, having a lot of neural connections, is also going to be beneficial because you need to be able to grab on. The grasping thumb is going to help with that. Also, feeling when your hands hit the branch so that you can close around them is going to help with that. There's another fossil from the Oligocene named Egyptopithecus that is represented by well-preserved crania and abundant jaws and teeth. Egyptopithecus is considered a primitive Old World anthropoid, has a small brain, has a long snout. And so this ties over into our discussion of catarrhines versus platyrrhines, that we've got these long snout-nosed species in the Old World, whereas in the New World we develop this flatter face. The Egyptopithecus could be really close to the ancestry of both Old World monkeys and apes, so could be a candidate for the last common ancestor between Old World monkeys and apes. And Egyptopithecus really helps to bridge the gap between the Eocene fossils and the succeeding Miocene hominoids. It's really this transitional fossil. And so out of Egyptopithecus, potentially, we've got the separate evolution of the diversity of Old World Oligocene monkeys, as well as the first Miocene ape. So when we talk about the Oligocene, it's planet of the monkeys. We've also got the first appearance of apes towards the end of the Miocene. The Miocene extends from 23 to 5 million years ago. We've got a great deal of evolutionary activity, specifically when we're looking at fossil apes, and this is our best literal planet of the apes. We've got monkeys and apes, specifically apes across Europe, Africa, and Asia. They're rich fossils in places like Spain and France, Turkey, Greece. We've got diverse and highly successful groups of hominoids that do really, really well, basically, until there's a climatic shift. It's a climatic shift that is tied with the extinction of most of the great apes that we see across the Miocene. We've got thousands of fossils, dozens of different sites. The continental land masses reached their approximate modern positions during the Miocene, which of course limited any transfer, any gene flow between the New World and Old World, made paths between Africa and Asia and Europe a little more restricted. You know, you kind of only have this one way through which you can go. We see some complex evolutionary relationships that are hard to simplify, but we break up the Miocene primates into three predominant groups. We have the African forms that persisted from 23 to 14 million years ago. This includes a genus called Proconsul. Proconsul is basically ape-like from the neck up, but very monkey-like from the neck down. So early in this evolutionary divergence between monkeys and apes. These teeth specifically have a crest arrangement of the molars that is used to characterize apes. We've got European forms from 16 to 11 million years ago that are quite derived and thusly are probably evolutionary dead ends. We've got some notable fossils including Dryopithecus, Oranopithecus. Dryopithecus was across Europe, and Oranopithecus specifically refers to fossil finds in Greece and Turkey. The evolutionary status of these is up in the air. We also have the Asian forms from 15 to 5 million years ago that include Shivapithecus. Shivapithecus is very derived and is thought to be ancestral to modern-day orangutans. Also in Asia, we've got a species that your text doesn't mention, but is notable just in its kind of it's kind of out there, and that is Gigantopithecus, largest ape to have ever lived, 12 to 14 feet tall, persisted up to about 400,000 years ago in isolated places like Vietnam, and so may have overlapped with Homo erectus. And the reason I like Gigantopithecus, I mean, for one, it was mentioned in the live action Jungle Book version that came out fairly recently. Instead of King Louie being an orangutan, he was Gigantopithecus, but more so because it could be a source of the widespread giant hominid-like creatures that we call Sasquatch, Yeti, or Bigfoot. So it is possible that we've got oral traditions surrounding giant apes that go back to our shared evolutionary history with Homo erectus. There are four general points that we need to talk about with respect to Miocene hominids, the Miocene apes. In general, they're widespread geographically. They are very numerous. They have a very long persistence. They survive for the entirety of the Miocene. They are also poorly understood. We do have fossils, but we have very few complete skeletons, so it's kind of hard to piece together. I mean, we get teeth, we get fragments of postcranial skeletons, but we don't have a fantastic picture of what even one of these species would have looked like. There are 6 conclusions that are born out of the Miocene, though. These fossils represent hominoids. They are more closely related to the ape-human lineage than they are Old World monkeys. So these Miocene apes differentiated after the ancestor of modern-day great apes and modern-day hominins, or the human line, diverged from Old World monkeys. These are not just large-bodied Old World monkeys that lost their tails. They are large-bodied, which indicates that they are more closely connected to great apes than lesser apes. They are very derived, so they probably mostly represent evolutionary dead ends. There are some that may be candidates for ancestors of modern-day great apes. Civipithecus is closely related to modern-day orangutans, for example. And then we've got to bring up that at the end of the Miocene, at this point between about 6 and 8 million years, we've got hominins diverging from fossil apes that specifically possess this adaptation for bipedal locomotion. So here we just have a few pictures of some of these Miocene apes. We've got proconsul. Proconsul, we've got an abundance of skeletal material. So we do get a really good picture. And in looking here at proconsul, you can see that the legs and arms are roughly the same size. You can see it's a pretty small brain case. What you can't see, of course, from this image are the teeth, but proconsul didn't yet have that commitment towards more of an upright posture that we see in great apes. Dryopithecus is perhaps ancestral to modern day African apes. We've got Oranopithecus that is distinct to Turkey and Greece. We've got Shivapithecus as an ancestor to modern day orangutans. And then we have two fossils here that weren't mentioned in your text, Kororopithecus and Nakalopithecus, that perhaps are our ancestor of modern day African apes. So both are thought to be fairly closely related to whatever was our proto-African ape, proto-human ancestor before gorillas diverged. And so particularly with Kororopithecus looking for a lot of similarities with gorillas, of course the Nakalopithecus artistic rendering gives us a face that's somewhat chimp-like. We don't have an abundance of African ape fossils because apes only came to Africa fairly recently. You know that we tend to think of all primates because there's so many of them in Africa, and then all apes, all hominins evolving in Africa, and that's really not the case. The divergence of apes happened across Europe and Asia as well. But Europe was subtropical, really warm, really moist, and really had kind of this niche available for ape differentiation. So as we look at this split between African great apes and hominins, there was a Eurasian ancestor that moved south into Africa as we had a drying and cooling trend. So the forests across Europe and southern Asia were shrinking and becoming mixed woodlands or grasslands, and thusly this Eurasian ape that had kind of this upright posture and an adaptation for knuckle walking moved back into Africa. This was critical in enabling the lineage to withstand the loss of arboreal habitats, this upright posture and knuckle walking. Without this, apes wouldn't move as effectively on the ground. And this knuckle walking was pretty energetically beneficial for this kind of migration back into Africa. Once apes returned to Africa, some returned to the forests, critically those that give rise to modern gorillas, modern chimps, modern bonobos. Others settled into these varied woodland environments. There's this mixed woodland utilization by chimpanzees, for example. And then one ape, the one that we descended from, eventually invaded open territories by committing to a terrestrial lifestyle. Our last kind of common ancestor, our source kind of hominin, would have been living in a mixed woodland environment, though. It wouldn't have been strictly dense tropical rainforest, nor would it have been strictly open savanna. There is a degree of flexibility or there would be a degree of flexibility demonstrated in these likely fossil ancestors to African apes and hominins. They were able to leave, early apes were able to leave Africa because they had adaptations in their jaws and teeth that gave them the ability to exploit a broader diet, specifically with the way the cusps are shaped and kind of the furrowing beneath or between the cusps. The Eurasian great apes evolved an array of skeletal adaptations that permitted them to exploit a variety of ecological niches. So this included suspensory locomotion, this included this upright stance and knuckle walking. They also see a grade shift. Apes have larger brains than monkeys, and this grade shift in brain size allows them to grapple with complex social and ecological challenges. These modifications made it possible for a few to survive the dramatic climate change that happened around 9 million years ago, where forests were shrinking and the savanna was spreading, and much of Europe was becoming more woodland, open areas versus dense forest. And so the lineage that produced African apes and humans was pre-adapted to coping with problems of a radically changing environment. So they were perfectly poised then to develop into these early hominins.